In a new book of mine, I'm covering the essentials of risk management. Now, you may not be aware, but I'm a risk management professional by trade. I've done business development. I tend to see that there's an intersection between supply chain, risk management, and business development. An organization that has low risks in their ability to receive raw materials and to process them into some kind of deliverable tend to be more profitable organizations. So I'm putting together this book prompted by recruiters and prompted by some peers in the industry to cover the foundations or the essentials of risk management. And why is this important? Well, first off, risk management is a structure inside your organization that defines your risk appetite, your company's abilities to address risk, and your approach to it. And this is at a minimum. You're going to compile all this into a risk management framework, but essentially, all organizations have some kind of law, rule, or regulation that they need to follow. And in following these laws, rules, and regulations, it is critical that you have a plan to do so, not necessarily because it is the most effective way to eliminate risk. Sometimes not doing anything is the best way to eliminate risk, meaning don't engage in a risk. But if you're not engaging in risk, you're not having some upside. So it's a risk to develop a product and serve it to a marketplace. What risks are associated with that? Well, there are consumer safety risks, there are reputational risks, there is a bunch of categories of risks. What we're talking about right now in the essentials is that risk and control classification. So, as I build out this book, I'm going to cover sections of it in a podcast format. If you have questions about risk management, you can visit me at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. So, first off, I am Justin Hitt. I am the publisher of Inside Strategic Relations, where we help you transform business relationships into profits. And we do this by understanding the systems of business relationships. And there's a special relationship in risk management that has to be maintained at all times. And it is not the relationship with your regulators. It is not the relationship between first line, which is the business itself, and second line, which is kind of an internal audit team. It's not the relationship with external auditors. It's the service to your customers. First and foremost, your service to your customers, the value you deliver to the customers, the integrity of your product to the customers is more important than all these other things because that is the foundation to reduce risk. There's nothing more that's going to mess up your business than an upset customer, especially today with cancel culture and the internet. One bad customer sounds like 10,000. And we don't want those customers to be upset. We don't want those customers to be defrauded. We don't want those customers to receive a product that is less than what we've promised. So, the very first place we're going to look in this is how do we serve our customers by lowering risk, by detecting risk. From there, the regulators, everything else will kind of take care of itself. But we start with a risk type classification. So, what risks are appropriate or relevant to the products or services you deliver to your customers? Okay, if you start there, if you're in a construction services company, you're going to have a different kind of risks than a financial services company. But there's risk categories. These are going to become your standard categories. They're going to be the top level risk categories. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about reputation, human resources. Um, there's a data risk. There's a reporting risk. It all really depends on your industry. But again, if you write these things down in one place, you're going to have a guideline to work with, and that is your risk type categories. Each of those risk types will have titles and descriptions and the characteristics of that risk type. Now, the good news is you can go out and get COSO. You can get there's ISO related. There's a lot of different types depending on your industry of risk categorizations that are prepackaged by some association, and they're going to have all this documentation. The key is internalizing these things and identifying the problems in your business. So I mentioned one already. If you deliver a less than quality product to your customer, you have a reputational risk associated with the customer not being happy, going online and talk about how unhappy they are. You have a safety risk depending on the type of product that you've delivered. If it's less than quality, it could break, they could get injured. You have third party risks. What if your supplier is providing something that is less than quality and you're incorporating it into your product? It then breaks, it ruins your reputation, it ruins, have a lawsuit associated with it, you have a financial loss associated with it. Did you check that third party to make sure they're complying with at least the minimal state of your what you feel to be acceptable? You're going to have control classification. So how do we prevent and detect risks in our environment? Well, we have the risk categorizations. Each business will come along and say that they accept or they don't accept a certain type of risk. You might have a second level category of risk. So there's the high level category that your industry identifies. And then, depending on your customer, your product, the specific regulations in your industry, you may have a level two risk type that is specific to your organization, that's tied to how you report or how you escalate risks. There's going to be different level twos. So a human resources risk, for example, in a construction company might be that you don't want workers who are using drugs on site. And so you have a drug testing policy. Where a financial services firm may not have a drug testing policy because they're more concerned about data loss, and so they want to make sure that they have a means of controlling access to data. And so they both are in the category of human resources, but they're different applications per se on that level two. Now, within that application, the control is a activity or kind of a switch, kind of a measure inside your process that helps control for risk. That's why it's called a control. But you're going to either detect or you're going to prevent a risk. Where do those risks come from? They came from the details of your risk categories. So a business unit can say, okay, well, we have a level two risk of human resources tied to a drug policy, to a drug testing policy. How do we ensure that the drug testing policy is adhered to? Maybe the drug testing policy says that all heavy equipment operators need to have a drug test at least once a month. And it's a certain type of drug test because they're operating heavy equipment. The risk is multiplied. Everybody agrees based on the risk categorization that you want to make sure the person who's operating a heavy crane is not, up on crack or something. So the control would be inside the hiring process or inside of the ongoing evaluation process. There's going to be some activity that is specific to make sure the testing happens. It isn't the actual testing itself, it's making sure the testing happens. It's going to be done by someone who is not administering the test, so there's a separation of duties. So, for example, you may have a third party provider who administers the test, the manager who signs off that the test has been completed, and then every quarter you have an internal auditor, a second line person who goes through and verifies that the tests are complete, that they have accurate documentation. This may be a requirement from your insurance company, this may be a requirement from a regulator, but ultimately the control makes sure things are done. Now, every control is going to have a control title. It's going to have description categorization. You may even have a number of controls if you have a large organization that are called common controls that are typical for certain types of business activities. And so those could be, again, you may have a drug testing requirement for the person running heavy equipment, but you might also have a drug testing requirement for somebody who's operating smaller equipment. But the policies are different because of the amount of risk available there. So you're going to be mapping the risk title, and again, this is not a visual medium, but there's a mapping between the risk that you've accepted or that you are going to address, the control that detects or prevents that risk, and then ultimately the business process itself or the procedures that are followed to create the deliverable for the client. Now, remember, we're always focusing on the customer. We're focusing on the end user and to make sure that customer is taken care of because a lot of problems stem from not taking care of your customer. You're also going to map in there somewhere as the deliverable. So, can you reach that deliverable? And I mentioned it earlier, the best way to prevent risk is to not do something that's risky. Then again, you've got to do something that has some risk to it to build a business. But if you can deliver that product without doing something that is surplus to the deliverable itself, you've reduced your risk. So controls also give you points of measure along a process. Now you can tie key performance indicators to your controls. You could use key performance indicators to determine if there's a problem. So, for example, the percentage of or the number of defects per thousand. Perhaps you're doing a grading project and you do a certain number of soil samples for compaction over an area. So they're leveling off an area to build a building, and you, based on the square footage of that area that's leveled, you do a certain number of compaction tests in perhaps a grid or perhaps a certain type of pattern, and then those have to have a certain variance or a certain um, percentage that meets the specification. And now this could be set out by an industry standard. It could be set out by the engineers who designed the project. But ultimately, that is a control activity that has specific measures or conditions, and it's then tied to a risk. Now let's look at our when things go wrong, because every complex environment has to push the edge between too risky and not risky enough in order to deliver a project on time. So we want to look at what happens when a control fails. Well, how do we know the control has failed? Well, you can have a catastrophic failure, which is not a good. That's an extreme in the risk tolerance. You could have a conditional or a consistent failure, meaning something is failing all the time. Like, for example, you may have one defect in 1,000, and that's acceptable, but five defects in 1,000 is not. And so when you reach the threshold of five defects per 1,000, you then trigger another process that goes and looks at the work. How you design that trigger is the control, but when it breaks, let's say you're at 10 defects per 1,000, what do you do next? Now remember, the risk management framework is going to define not only what risks you have in the organization, what controls you face, but the escalation process when a control is outside of threshold. This is very important because once you've identified what we'll call an issue, a defect in the system, a failure of a control, you need to have a specific management system to take the issue and identify the problem. From the problem, identify the root cause of the problem, and then have some kind of remediation or correction. Now, in the service of your customer, the best way to stay ahead or to be what we call preventative and proactive and preventative is to find the issues yourself. The last thing you need is for the customer to find out you got a problem or for a regulator or auditor to find out you've got a problem. Now, don't hear me the wrong way here, because I've had intimate conversations with business owners who hide the problems. They know they got a problem, but they didn't want to open an issue because it might make their group look bad. I'm going to tell you that the only reason you have issues is because you have ineffective controls. And so by opening the issue, you've increased the opportunity, you've increased the probability, you've increased the chance that you can fix your controls. If you just go on and fix your controls without mentioning the issue's still hiding there because audit will find it. If you avoid the issue because you want to save face or something, then you now have a problem that's only going to compound. So if you see a problem, document it. Now, the good news is if you document your problems using some kind of issue management system or approach, and we can talk about that in another episode, um, you'll be able to, again, identify the problem, create a problem statement, identify the root cause. Now, when doing those things, you're going to look over the risk types and the expectations for the risks. You're going to look at policies tied to the risk. You're going to look at the controls that were handling the risk, and then you're going to develop a plan to make things good. Now, if you have a problem with the customer or if you have a problem with a regulator, you can show them that you were proactive about addressing the problem. Now, that proactive nature is going to be backstopped by your risk management framework. So this is the message to listeners right now. If you're in an organization, a financial services organization, an insurance company, a large construction company, a defense contractor, any type of organization that is structured and has outside regulators, you have a risk management framework somewhere. Now, if you don't have one, then ask around because you should have one, and we can help you get one together. We can help you do what's called risk self-assessments. We can help you do the types of exploration that's necessary to know what risks you may or may not have. But ultimately, read your risk management framework. There are risk management frameworks that are standard to certain industries. I mentioned the construction industry because they face that. I mentioned defense contractors because they've got guidelines that are set up by the U.S. government or whatever government they're working for. And definitely financial services has the risk management framework. You need to read it because the last thing I want to warn you about is that for people who do not understand, who are not familiar with the risk management framework, there is a desire to so I already mentioned the desire to save face by hiding problems or to ignore problems rather than raising the issue. There's another problem where when people raise issues, they spend all their time working on issues and not making better controls so that they don't have issues. But finally, this is not an area to invent. When an auditor comes in, they're going to ask you for your risk management framework. They're going to ask you for the laws, rules, and regulations that are associated with what you're doing. They're going to ask you for the risk types and how those risk types are mapped to processes or projects. And then within those projects or processes, what are the controls? Then they're going to ask for a master control classification. And guess what happens? They already know the answers of what they're asking for. I've worked with audit teams. I've worked with KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, smaller. I've worked with a lot of different agencies. When they come in and do their discovery to start building out the scope of an audit, which by the way, if you're in an audit, it's not too late, but it's definitely a clue you got problems. Um, they already know the answers to the questions. When they say, "Get me a copy of your risk management framework," they're expecting a document that's clear and easy to follow. They're not expecting you to hem and haw or tell them what's in it. They're expecting a document. When they say, "Hey, give me a list of your level 1 risks," they don't just want a list of risks. They want a list of risks tied to the regulatory factors, tied to the policy, tied to everything else, which again is the descriptions and classifications of those risks. They want to see the level 1 risks because if you don't have level 1 risks, they don't care, then you wouldn't have level 2. And finally, when they're talking about controls, they want to see the controls separate of the process itself. They want to see the controls in the wild world that they're implemented, not in the world of fantasy in which we might implement them in the future. This is critical because these businesses that are worried about filing an issue or opening a self-discovered issue, or even saying there's a defect with their controls or their risk categorizations, um, they will always be found out in the fact that they cannot demonstrate that they have a plan or a program or a framework for handling risks. So if you've got problems, you will get an issue. And if you don't get an issue internally, you will get a regulatory finding because the regulators are in the business of finding problems. And as I've said it before, and as my mentors have taught me, if the regulators are going to find a problem, let's make it a minor one by finding all of our significant things. Now, in future podcasts, we can talk about the issue management side. We can talk about specifically what is a control and how do you develop controls. But in order to make this conversation maximum value to you, because a lot of my subscribers are looking for information on how to gain influence in an organization, how to build their career, I need to hear from you. Your questions will guide where we go next when it comes to risk management because it's not obvious to the majority of knowledge workers or business owners that risk management is something that gives them power over the outcomes of their organization. Very often auditing and risk and all that stuff is looked at as like a dangerous second thought that they don't want to be in an audit. They fear the audit. I'm saying prepare for the audit. Know that an audit might happen. Audit yourself in contrast with what your customer expectations are. So if the customer expects X, you want to make sure they're going to get X, but you also want to look out for future expectations. You want to look out for the expectations of third parties. You want to look out for all these other things. Document it somewhere so it doesn't become a giant, just a giant web of mess. You need the framework is the backbone of your entire risk program. And then ultimately educate your teams on how this works. Never be afraid to raise a risk. Now, culturally, you may raise a concern and you get dumped on. Okay, we can talk about how to raise concerns and what to do if the culture doesn't allow you to raise concerns. I've seen it in many environments where a legitimate concern comes up. The person gets crapped on because every issue sounds like more work. But my argument has always been that if you did it right the first time, then we wouldn't be talking about an audit. We wouldn't be talking about an issue. We would have effective controls that just work. That goes back again to the framework, the attitude and culture in your risk environment, and ultimately, this gives you the ability to prevent those big surprises. Those big surprises come when you least expect it and are most often already known in the organization. And imagine the difference here. An auditor comes up, a regulator comes up, and they say, "Look, we're going to audit you." And you say, "Wait a second. We appreciate you're going to come to audit us. Here's a risk management framework. Here's some of the documentation that you've asked for. And by the way, here are the three major issues that we're addressing. And we'd like your help to look at these." You could redirect their focus to the things that actually can be fixed. You could redirect their focus and scope the audit much cleaner so that you get the benefit of their third party opinion or their third party review. And you could also just demonstrate that you got your act together, and the auditors will leave you alone. They'll find something minor and they'll leave you alone. So again, I'm Justin Hitt from Inside Strategic Relations. I believe risk management is a powerful part of building strong business relationships, especially the relationship your business has with customers. Now, there are other relationships that we can talk about, but I want you to guide the conversation by visiting www.insidestrategicrelations.com. Go to the contact page and ask your questions about risk management. Again, I'm writing a book on it, The Essentials of Risk Management, and I don't know how technical it should be for the audience, but I definitely want to highlight that thread that a strong risk management program is better than customer service. In fact, it could be making sure your customer service is good. But depending on the organization, a strong risk management platform keeps you out of the regulatory jail and sometimes literal jail by delivering what you say you're going to deliver and then having systems in place to make sure you're delivering those things consistently. Risk titles, risk levels, risk control classifications, control titles, all that stuff may sound foreign right now, but it is an essential part of having effective business processes that reduce the risk of your organization and increase the probability of satisfactory delivery of deliverables to customers and long-term growth and prosperity for your organization. I want to thank you for being a part of what we do here today. Your comments, questions, they're always welcome. And we look forward to serving you in the future. Risk management is a powerful concept, and it is a game changer when it comes to business relationships. I'll see you in the next episode. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations.